The essential process at the heart of the energy transition is switching from fossil fuels to electricity generated by clean energy technologies, augmented by some low carbon fuels, maybe like hydrogen. So, and economic modelers say that Canada, like other advanced economies, will require 2 to 3 times as much electricity as it currently generates by 2050. Well, you would think that electricity and electricity systems would be, an election issue in this campaign, and that is not the case. In fact, most of the platforms have just 1 or 2 odd, sort of indirect references to electricity. And I want to talk to Professor Sara Hastings-Simon from the University of Calgary about why that is and what the federal government's role in electricity systems should be or could be, how that might be reflected in platforms. So welcome to the interview, Sara.
Thanks for having me.
So look, my blathering about electricity systems in Canada is there's a hard truth under that, which is that the Constitution gives jurisdiction over energy, including electricity, to the provinces, and very little to the federal government. Is that the central difficulty we face here?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of the challenge. And, it's kind of interesting to note that this is not unique to Canada, and the US is sort of grappling with some of the similar issues as they're thinking about how to expand their transmission lines. And, it's really, it's a Canadian issue, but it's also, truly a North American issue, just given how integrated our power systems are already and what potential there is for them to be integrated going forwards. But indeed, it's not something that the federal government could just come in and say, we are building all of these lines all on their own. It's really, the electricity systems themselves are aligned with provincial boundaries. And that's where most of the control lies.
Yes, and many of the provincial electricity systems are under the control of government-owned crown utilities. In BC Hydro and Quebec Hydro and Manitoba Hydro and SaskPower and on it goes, which adds another layer of complexity here. And another layer of complexity is the fact that a lot of our trade goes north and south instead of east and west. So how could the federal government, what role could the federal government play in modernizing and upgrading the national power grid and electricity system to prepare us for this new electric economy?
So one, I think, big obvious first role that they can play is as a funder. So building transmission lines costs money, and by providing that money, for example, from something like an infrastructure bank, this is very much meets the definition of infrastructure. I think that can hopefully play a role in starting to see these lines being built out. There's a lot of good reasons to build out this transmission infrastructure when you start to think about where we have underdeveloped natural resources for low carbon electricity, right? So sitting here, as I do in Alberta, the prairie provinces have a really, really significant wind resource, solar resource as well, which has been developed, to some degree, but there's really still a huge potential to develop that out further, and having transmission lines that connect the country east-west, although also down into the US as well, can really help to integrate significantly larger amounts of renewable energy. Because one of the ways to address the challenge of renewable energy being variable is by spreading the area that's using energy from a certain place over a larger geographic area. Because when it's windy in Alberta, it may be not windy in some parts of the States or in other parts of Canada. And so there's a lot of real potential there. And I think funding those, the development of that line is one big way that the federal government can act. I think there's some others that are worth investigating as well too, though.
Well, here's one that I'd like to get your opinion on, and that is just starting the conversation. I mean, one of the things that the federal government can do, it has forums like the, I forget, the meetings, the regular meetings of the premiers and the prime minister, but nevertheless, it has forums where it can bring all the political leaders together to have these kinds of discussions. And I think, whoever's prime minister at the end of this election could put that on the agenda and start working towards some kind of cooperative agreement amongst the provinces. Would you agree or disagree?
Yeah, I think definitely it does require coordination. It also, it links into the province's own plans around both economic development when we think about the value of developing out these resources, but of course, also decarbonization and, really getting to highly decarbonized grid, having that transmission line can definitely be a big part of that. So I think facilitating that conversation, again, province to province, and then also when you talk about the interactions and the conversations between the prime minister and the president of the U.S. as well, because we do have, transmission line connections that run north-south, and those can also be, increased over time.
Right. And the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in the US just, I think a couple of months ago, produced a study about further integrating the Canadian and US electricity systems. I interviewed one of the authors of the report, and there are huge savings and efficiencies to be gained by taking that kind of a coordinated approach. And there's no way it can happen without the federal government leading that charge.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, the federal government can also, while they are limited in what they can control around the electricity system itself, they do have other mechanisms related to, emissions, the regulation of large industrial sites, and climate change in general, such that I think that there are ways that not only can they set up that conversation to happen and provide the carrot in terms of funding for the transmission lines, but I think that they can also find ways to provide a little bit of that stick of sort of pushing the provinces to basically have plans to decarbonize the electricity system. And once you're looking to do that, then building those transmission lines becomes a very obvious part of the solution. And so, putting the pressure on in that way, while then also being there with funding to do the build out and support to, have those conversations, I think is part of a holistic, plan to get there.
Now, I have an idea that I'd like to get your opinion on, and that is every time I talk to an economist about this, they keep coming back to the idea of you want more renewables, you need better markets. Or in some cases like BC, you need markets, period. And that's a very difficult conversation, because now you're talking about giving up some control from the provincial side to a market-based system. And Alberta has one, and Ontario sort of has a Frankenstein, it's a little bit of market, it's a little bit of regulation, a whole bunch of subsidies and so on. But many of the other provinces don't have markets at all, but they do participate in markets between, with the US, for instance, BC and Alberta are in the Western electricity market. So what do you think about the idea of the federal government saying, you know what, we get more renewable energy quicker and more efficiently at a lower cost if we had more, markets built into our system? What do you think of that?
So, I think one question is where you're talking about that competition coming in. And so, the big difference is, as but between Alberta and BC is in Alberta, there's no, as you say, there's a market. So anybody can build, anybody who's qualified can build a generator and bid into the system. When you get into a regulated system like in British Columbia, one of the sort of big distinctions that allows integration of renewables more easily or not is not necessarily whether the structure overall is more regulated or with a market, but actually what happens if you show up as an independent power producer. Is there a mechanism into that system or not? And so in a very highly controlled system, the BC Hydro or whoever it is has the right to basically say, I don't care if you can sell me wind power at a cost less than what I'm paying for my other power. I get to choose whether or not I want to do that or not. Whereas, in the US, one of the big laws that sort of really helped with the development of renewables is one that essentially says that it required that regulated markets have to allow independent power producers to sell into that market and at so if they're able to do so with renewable energy at a lower cost, they basically have a mechanism to get that built. So that's sort of, if we think about integrating renewables, that's what becomes, I think, more important than the overall structure of the market. There's a lot of debate about whether, a deregulated or regulated market is better for decarbonization. And I think there's, people who have views on both sides of that, but making sure that renewable energy, that is able to produce at a cost that is lower than, what electricity would come from other sources is really key to enable that to happen. And so that's again where, or in the case of a very highly regulated market, simply having targets that say, you have to get to a certain level of decarbonization. And again, that forces the entity that controls the market to go out and procure that renewable energy. So I think it's less about the overall structure being specifically better under one versus the other, but it's just a different set of tools that you want to use to make sure that, that renewable energy that's out there is getting there. The other thing that I would note, though, is that there is a bit of a chicken and egg problem when it comes to transmission lines and renewable energy, exactly because even in deregulated markets, transmission lines are typically a regulated entity, because it doesn't make sense to have sort of competition and be building out these multiple layers. And so where, going back to the Texas example, they saw a lot of success with an initiative they took that's referred to as CREZ. So they basically said, let's look at where we could build renewables, and let's make the decision to invest in and build out transmission lines from those areas which were further from load centers, more rural areas of the state. And then once that space is there, then developers can come in and build those renewable energy projects. So I think that's one of the other big challenges around renewable energy development, is making sure that there is that transmission capacity available, and getting over that kind of chicken and egg problem of, well, developers are going to be hesitant to invest a lot in starting development projects and sort of even looking to see if you can develop if there isn't that transmission line capacity there. But if you don't get transmission line capacity, you need to have kind of, as it stands now, you need to have evidence of a need for that transmission line to get built.
Right. So let's talk about how that might be reflected in in the party platforms during this election. Like I could see, for instance, the conservatives would be talking about more market-based systems. That might be their angle. The liberals I could see being big infrastructure supporters, like interties and that sort of thing. And I could see the NDP talking about communities, First Nations, and so on, being able to build out solar and wind projects and having the kind of support and capacity and funding and access, that sort of thing. And I don't see that in those platforms. And I think that's for me, that's a big issue that we're missing in this election campaign and the discourse around energy.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, I'm sure there's, a lot of reasons why that is. And it's probably a political scientist could tell you much better than I can as to why. But I think, one thing that stands out to me is just the conversation around renewable energy is incredibly complex, and different people come into it from different directions, right? So, I tend to think about it in terms of decarbonization, but when we talk about a federal election and think about, parties that are campaigning in Ontario, for example, I'm sure that, the discourse around the development of wind and the challenges that were had there features big in people's minds. So I think it's just another reminder that about the general complexity of these challenges, because it's not just about, okay, where do I get my electricity from, or how much is it going to cost? We're really talking about, interfacing with people's lives in a number of different places. And so that adds a complexity. The flip side is that it also, of course, adds a lot of opportunity. And we see, again, down in the States, there are a number of very conservative parts of the country that have a really accelerated development of wind energy because they see the economic benefits of it. But I think you're exactly right that there are very different ways that parties might approach the question. But it would be interesting to see more of that debate happening because I do think that there is a real both need and opportunity there.
Great, Sarah. Always appreciate your insights. Thank you very much for this.
Yeah, thanks for having me.